Chapter 2. It was Mr. Gryce from Social Services who told Martine that she would be moving to Africa, Cape Town, South Africa to be precise. South Africa? Cried Martine. Why South Africa? Well, said Mr. Gryce, it seems that your only surviving relative is, in fact, living on a game reserve in South Africa. A Mrs. Gwyn Thomas, who I'm told is your grandmother. Martine was stunned. I don't have a grandmother, she said slowly. Mr. Gryce frowned. He reached into his pocket for his glasses and consulted his file again. I assure you, there is no mistake. I have her letter here. He handed Martine a sheet of cream writing paper. And then can you kind of see the writing there? Dear Mr. Gryce, thank you for your condolences on the sad loss of my daughter Veronica Allen and her husband David, two of the finest people I have ever known. I was unaware that my daughter had stipulated that I should be her guardianship of their child, Martine, if anything happened to her. However, I will accept the responsibility. It's the least I can do. I can close an airplane ticket to Cape Town and $150 for the girl's expenses. I rarely go to the city, and I'd be grateful if you could ensure that she is appropriately clothed for the South African weather. Yours truly, Gwyn Thomas. Well, there was something about the tone of the letter that bothered Martine. Her grandmother didn't seem at all enthusiastic about the prospect of taking her on. Quite the reverse. From the sound of things, she expected Martine to be a burden. She couldn't even face the prospect of buying her a few summer clothes. She'd already adored Martine's parents, but that didn't mean she wanted to be stuck with Martine. And what about her grandfather? There was no mention of him. Martine handed the letter back to Mr. Gryce. I am not going, she said. She doesn't want me, and there's no way I'm going to live with someone who doesn't want me. I'd rather stick pins in my eyes. Mr. Gryce looked at her in consternation. It had been a trying morning, and he had a feeling that it was about to get worse. What's the matter with his supervisor that she's always giving him difficult jobs? But Mrs. Thomas is your legal guardian, he tried. I'm not going, Martine repeated stubbornly, and you can't make me. Mr. Gryce gathered his papers together in a messy bundle, knocked over a glass of water in the process. I'll be back, he told Martine, ignoring the puddle and the ink turning into watercolor on his documents. I have to make a phone call. Martine sat staring at the smoke-stained wallpaper in Mr. Gryce's office, feeling much more afraid than she had let on. The past few weeks had been a blur. For the first nightmarish 5 days after the fire, she stayed with the Morrisons until their sons returned from a college rugby tour. Then she moved in with a friend of her mother's who was unable to cope with a grieving child. Finally, she was driven off to the house of Miss Rose, her English teacher, who was going to take care of her until her future was decided. Everywhere she went, people wore overbright smiles and were full of helpful suggestions. But as soon as she left the room, she could hear hushed conversations in which the word orphan and all alone in the world were frequently used. Martine was too dazed and heartbroken to care. Most of the time she walked around with a crashing sensation in her head, as if she was falling into a well with no bottom. She couldn't eat, she couldn't sleep, she couldn't cry. The question she kept asking herself over and over was, why? Why had she been saved and her parents hadn't? It seemed so unfair. The firemen had praised her bravery and told her she had done the right thing. They said if she'd opened the door even a crack to try to get to her parents, she would have been swallowed by the blaze. But it was hard not to feel guilty. What had happened to her now? Was she really going to be sent away to a stranger in South Africa? And then she spotted a cream envelope on Mr. Gryce's desk. Well, there was something familiar about it. She picked it up and studied the return address. It was written in neat blue pen, Gwyn Thomas, Zimbabwe Game Reserve, Cape Providence, South Africa. Martine searched her memory. Where had she seen the handwriting before? Then it came back to her. She watched her mom opening these envelopes every month for as long as she could remember. Nothing had ever been said about them, but Martine had always detected a change in her mom after she had read the letters. She seemed to smile more or laugh more easily. To Martine, sitting abandoned and confused among Mr. Gryce's dusty files, it was all more upsetting that her mom had never told her the letters came from her grandmother, or even that she had a grandmother. Why was it all such a secret? Martine thought about the signature on the letter. Gwyn Thomas. It sounded so stern. She found it difficult to grasp that such a person might be her grandmother, let alone that she might have to call her grandmother, or worse, Granny. She couldn't think about her as Gwyn. For some reason, the whole name, Gwyn Thomas, stuck in her head. Mr. Gryce returned to the office shaking his head. I'm afraid your options are extremely limited, he said. I've managed to find you a bed in an orphanage in Upper Berkeley. It's okay, Martine interrupted. I've decided I'll go to South Africa after all. Mr. Gryce heaved a heavy sigh of relief. Well, that settles it. Right from the start, it was obvious that everyone around Martine was much more excited about her new future than she was. A game reserve in Africa? Said Miss Rose in awe. Just think, Martine. It'll be like spending your life on safari. Mrs. Morrison seemed more convinced she'd be eaten by a tiger. You'll have to be vigilant, she told Martine. But oh, what an adventure it will be. Martine rolled her eyes. Mrs. Morrison was the kindest woman in the world, but she was absolutely clueless when it came to the animal kingdom. There were no tigers in Africa, Martine had to keep telling her, not unless they're in a zoo. Apart from that one detail, she herself knew very little about Africa. When she tried to picture it, all she could come up with was big yellow plains, umbrella trees, mangoes, dark faces, and blazing hot sun. She wondered if wild animals literally roamed the streets. Would she be able to have one as a pet? Martine's mom had been allergic to animals, so Martine had always been kept away from them. But ever since she was tiny, she yearned to have one of her own. Perhaps she could get a monkey. Then she remembered the tone of her grandmother's letters, and the crashing feeling came surging back. Gwyn Thomas did not sound like the kind of person who would say yes to a primate in her living room. If she even had a living room, for all Martine knew, her grandmother could live in a grass hut. At school, most of her classmates seemed to have forgotten that barely 3 weeks had gone by since her home had burned to the ground, and that she was hardly going to South Africa out of choice. You're so lucky, they kept telling her. You'll be able to learn to surf and everything. It'll be so cool. Listening to them, Martine thought that the one good thing about moving to Africa was that she'd never again have to enter the grim gates of Bodley Brook School. She didn't fit in here. Come to think of it, she never fit anywhere with children her own age. Somehow it hadn't mattered where her mom and dad were around, because they were her best friends. Her dad had been a doctor who'd worked very long hours, but in the summer he took time off and they'd go camping in Cornwall, where her mom would paint and she and her dad would swim or fish, or he'd teach her a little about first aid. And every weekend, come rain or shine, they always had fun, even if it was only making pancakes. Now it was over, and there was a hole in Martine's heart. On Saturday morning, the day before she was due to fly to Cape Town, Miss Rose took her shopping for summer clothes on Oxford Street in London. An icy gray rain was falling and the entire road was a sea of frenzied shoppers and tourists poking umbrellas in each other's eyes. But nothing could dampen Miss Rose's enthusiasm. Look at these cute shorts, she'd say to Martine as they fought their way around the gap. What a great baseball cap. Oh, I can just see you in this stripy red t-shirt. Martine just let her go on. If the truth be known, she felt ill. Her stomach was a bubbling cauldron of nerves, and her mouth was dry with fear at the prospect of what tomorrow would bring. Whatever you think, she kept saying as Miss Rose presented her with clothing options. Yes, it's nice, and I'm sure it will be fine. She ended up with 2 pairs of khaki shorts, a pair of jeans, 4 t-shirts, a baseball cap, and a pair of tough camel-colored hiking boots. The only time she was forced to put up a fight was when Miss Rose tried to insist on a floral print dress. Martine, who had cropped brown hair and bright green eyes, had refused to wear a dress since the age of 5, and had no intention of starting now. I'll get bitten by a snake if I don't have proper protection, she told Miss Rose. But surely you run the same risk if you wore shorts, protested her teacher. Yes, said Martine, but that's different. Have you ever seen an explorer who didn't wear shorts? Back in Hampshire that evening, Miss Rose cooked a farewell dinner for Martine, a roast chicken with crispy potatoes, garden peas, homemade Yorkshire pudding, and onion gravy. Mr. and Mrs. Morrison came over, and Mrs. Morrison presented Martine with a pair of binoculars who had belonged to an older uncle. "To help you spot the big cats," she told Martine. Martine was very moved, particularly when Mrs. Morton also gave her a large slice of homemade chocolate cake, carefully packed in a lunchbox for her journey. "I wish you much happiness, dear," Miss Morrison said emotionally. "Remember that you'll always have a home with Mr. Morrison and me." Mr. Morrison grunted in agreement. He was a man of few words, and his wife turned away to thank the teacher for the meal, put his hand in his coat pocket, and brought out a carved wooden box. "To keep you safe," he said in a low voice, giving it to Martine. Then he opened his car door and started the engine. "Ready, love?" he called to Mrs. Morrison. "See you then, Martine." Martine waited until she was alone in Miss Rose's spare room that night to open the box. Inside she found a pink maglet flashlight, a Swiss Army knife, a first aid kit. She could hardly believe her eyes. He'd laid everything out on the bed and spent several rapturous minutes reading the survival leaflet that accompanied it. The generosity of everyone was very touching. After a while she repacked her presents carefully, turned off the light, and lay on a bed. A full moon beamed through the window, laying on a silver patch across the room. Despite herself, Martine began to feel excited. By tomorrow night she'd be on a plane bound for Africa and for a life she cannot even begin to imagine. For better or worse, fate was closing the door on her past.